Now we're on Daf Nun Zayin Amud Beis. Ashkechenami Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba. So Rabbi Abba tells over to Rabbi Zera after he follows Rabbi Zera to Eretz Yisrael, and he transmits a conversation that he had with Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba. Ashkechenami Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba Yosef v'kabodik b'tzomas hagidin. Again, this whole business about tzomas hagidin, right? That's the area all the way on the bottom of the bird, which is a junction of 16 sinews. And Rabbi Yirmiyah was examining to see if all these sinews are still intact. The Akshele, and again, this is Rabbi Abba who's asking a question to Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba in the presence of Rabbi Zera. Lo Savro Lo Mar Hod Yomer of Huna Marav Shmutas Yerech Ba'of Kshera. And again, the premise is number one, that our tradition in the transmission of the Torah of Huna in Bavel is that Shmutas Yerech Ha'of is Kshera. And how much more so would Tzomas Hagidin be Kshera? Why do you bother with your examination of the Tzomas Hagidin? Amalei Anomas Nisan Yadana. We have a Mishnah. Behema Shenechtechu Ragleh Min Arkuva Lamata Kshera Min Arkuva Lamala Psula V'chein Nital Tzomas Hagidin. In other words, the V'chein is adding on to a case where there was a severance of above the joint, which makes it treifa, and now we're adding Tzomas Hagidin. And if you'll tell me, well, that's only in an animal and not in a bird, va'amar Rav Allah, Rav added his comment as we saw on Amud Aleph on that Mishnah. He said v'chein ba'of. So now that Rabbi Abba hears this transmission from Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba in the name of Rav Huna, in the name of Rav, that Tzomas Hagidin is treif. Ihochi kasha the Rav had the Rav. Now we have a steer between Rav and Rav, because we said that if a dislocated thigh makes the bird into a treifa, which is called shmutas yerech ha'of, then so too Tzomas Hagidin would make it treifa. And if Tzomas Hagidin makes it treifa, which is all the way on the bottom, how much more so with regard to a dislocated thigh bone? So therefore we have a steer between Rav and Rav. Our tradition has it that Rav holds that Tzomas Hagidin, that Shmutas Yerech Ha'of is Kshera. Now you're telling me that Rav holds V'chein Ba'of, that if there's a severance of the Tzomas Hagidin, it's Treif, Ishtik. So in other words, Rabbi Yirmiyah did not have an answer. The Akshile, and I asked him, what are you talking about? This is not a problem. I have an easy resolution to this problem. Dilma Shani Le Rav. Rav makes this between Shmuta and Chatucha. The Amar Ali, and he said to me, as we saw on Amud Aleph, At Mefarsh Shmaite the Rav, Beferish Amar Rav, Shmuta Kshera, Chatucha Psula. Meaning that Shmutas Yerech Ha'of is Kshera. The dislocation of the thigh bone does not render the bird Kshera, but Chatucha, if you cut any of the sinews in the Tzomas Hagidin, it's Treifa. In any event, it would seem that As far as Bavel is concerned, the tradition has it of Rav Huna in the name of Rav that Shmuta b'yerech ha'of is kshera, v'atma b'yodcha. Now, Rabbi Abba turns to Reb Zera, who had been in Eretz Yisrael earlier, and he asked him, "What's going on over here? Do you have anything to say over here?" And Reb Zera says, "I have a different tradition. Hachi Omer Reb Chia bar Ashi Omer Rav." Now, I'm not sure if Reb Chia bar Ashi was in Eretz Yisrael or in Bavel, but in any event, he brought a tradition name of Rav, that Shmutas Yerech Bov Treifa. So over and over again, we're having the same thing, that there are two different transmissions attributed to Rav as to whether Shmutas Yerech Ha'of is Ksheira or Treifa. V'chein Rabbi Yaakov bar Idi Rabbi Yochanan Shmutas Yerech Ha'of Treifa. V'yomer Rabbi Yaakov bar Idi Il Moli Havi Rabbi Yochanan bi Asra di Ori Bechav Chevrasa Lehetera Lo Parkus. Meaning the reason why Rabbi Yochanan, in the case of a dislocation of the thigh bone, said it was treif, is because he wasn't in the presence of other colleagues of his who were matir and would make it regarding a shmutas yerecha of the dislocated thigh. Had he been there, and he would have heard their opinion, namely that shmutas yerecha of is kshera, he wouldn't have blinked. The Omer Chanina, Omer Rebbe. Now we're going back one generation back to Rebbe. That's already back to the Tanoim. Shmutas Yerecha Of Be'of Kshera. Not only that, Tarnagolas Hoisalol Reb Chanina Shenishmita Yerech Shela. Right, the hen had a thigh bone that was dislocated. Heviyu Lifnei Rebbe V'Tirala. and the end of the story is very cute. Molcha. Rabbi Chanina salted it to put it away and preserve it, like deep freeze. Why? And he used it to show his Talmidim, to demonstrate to them that Rabbi Yudah Nasi was matir shmutas yerecha of. And after the whole discussion back and forth, the Gemara now comes to the final ruling, the final conclusion, the less hilchasa kichol hanishmaitita, even though we had Rav Huna in the name of Rav, and we have Rav Yaakov bar Idi in the name of Rav Yochanan, and we also have Rabbi Chia bar Ashi in the name of Rav, and all of them agree that Shmutas Yerecha Of is kshera, except for Rabbi Chia, is less hilchsa kol shnata. We're not mekil, but rather we're going to follow kiha, like the following story: Dishal Rabbi Yossi bar Nahoroi as Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. Okay, so the first part of this is not directly relevant to us, but kederas kana bekama. Right? If there's a hole in the trachea, at what point, right? So we're talking about the windpipe that has a hole in it. At what point is that hole large enough that it renders the animal a treifa? Amalei, so Shimon Levi responded, Mishnah Shlema Shadi, why are you asking me this question when it's explicit in the Mishnah? Ad ki isar italki. Amalei, so Rabbi Yossi ben Oroi responded, Halo Rachel achas hoisa b'shkunaseinu. There was a ewe, a little animal in our neighborhood, sheniktar kanishala, and its windpipe was cut. The asule krubin shel kana v'chaisa. Now this cut was as large as an iser, which according to the Mishnah now should make the trachea into a treifa, and yet they took a patch or a sheath of a reed, and somehow they fashioned it in such a way that they were able to like plug up the hole in the trachea, in the windpipe, and guess what happened? The animal healed. So we see that the animal is not a treifa; it's not a vital injury. Amalei Rabbi Shimon Levi says, "Al da'at samach." You're relying on this story. So this is the final conclusion of that whole discussion about the dislocation of the thigh bone of a bird, it's treif. B'Tanagolas Hoysalola Rabbi Shimon ben Chalafta, also one of the Tanoim, Shenishmita Yerech Shalah, its thigh bone was located, and they healed it. And even though they healed it, the animal was treif. They made a splint. Asu leish foferish kana v'choisa. They made a splint and they put it into the trachea in such a way that it would uh, clog up the hole of the trachea. And guess what? Mind-boggling. It healed. Wow. And yet it's treif. The story is that the animal got better and then it died. It got better and there was a temporary kind of improvement in its health based on this various kind of tubes and reeds and so forth and so on. But at the end, when he got to the final line, the finish line of 12 months, Gishtarvin, it died. So we see clearly that Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi accepted the final halacha that the shmuta b'yerech ha'of is treif. Dislocation of the thigh bone renders a bird treif. Now, we mentioned Rabbi Shimon ben Chalafta, and he came up with a new experiment. He made a splint out of a tube of a reed and it healed. So now we're going to talk a little bit about Rabbi Shimon ben Chalafta. Amar Lav Rabbi Shimon ben Chalafta she'askam b'dvarim. He used to experiment. He was an experimentalist. Now, Rabbi Yehuda Omer that im nitla notza psula. We're talking about that special kind of a wing called a down that we said is smaller than the actual feathers, and it kind of surrounds the body of the bird like a skin around the body of the bird. And Rabbi Yehuda says if you remove that skin, it's like flayed. And we know that in animals, a flayed animal is treif. So too in birds, it's treif. And now Rabbi Shimon ben Chalafta is going to disprove Rabbi Yehuda with an experiment. Because Tarnagolas Hoysalola Rabbi Shimon ben Chalafta, Shenitla Notzla Shalah. In fact, it was exactly like the reality of Rabbi Yehuda that the down was removed, and Inicha B'Tanur. Oh, I don't think it means he burnt it up to a crisp. I think it means he warmed it up inside an oven. Tola Lea, again, I don't begin to understand this Gemara. It just sounds like voodoo, pardon the expression. Anyway, Tola Lea b'mat l'shol tarsium. He wraps up the whatchamacallit, the hen in a coppersmith's mat, a strip of leather that coppersmiths placed before them to catch any dust and fillings that came off as they work. Anyway, it's a thick piece of leather. He gives a fancy explanation in the name of Rashi that the natural conductivity of copper particles embedded in it generated warmth. Okay, fine, we need warmth. And what happened? You just told me, Rabbi Yehuda, that the head is going to die. It didn't die at all. On the contrary, Gidlo Knafayim, it grew a replacement for the down. Yosef Rishonim. And the second round was even better, more improved, more healthy, more solid than the first round. So you see that removal of the down does not necessarily imply that there's a fatal injury. Vidilma, how does Rabbi Shimon Chalafta disprove Rabbi Yehuda? Maybe Rabbi Yehuda Kosovar treifa mishabachas, that if you have an animal that's treif, it's going to die before it reaches its 12 months, elapses 12 months. But in the meantime, you could apply some sort of medicinal administration and cure, and it'll get better, but then it gets worse. So by the time you get to 12 months, it's going to drop dead. Im Kain says the Gemara, "B'midim mitrafa ba." This is very far fetched. That the very thing that makes it into a treifa igdila knafayim achronim yosim and rishonim. How can it be that the removal of the down, according to you, Rabbi Yehuda, is a fatal injury? The bird is going to die. And now you're telling me we did an experiment and we got the down to be better than it was from the beginning. So this is not just some sort of temporary administration. Now, Rabbi Yehuda had his opinion. Rav Shimon Chalafta, as an experimenter, performed an experiment to the hand to disprove Rabbi Yehuda's opinion. So apparently, Rabbi Shimon ben Chalafta had this reputation of being an experimenter. My askam b'dvarim. Why, how did he earn that reputation? Amar Misharshia, he learned it from the ant, not my mother's sister. I mean, the little ants on the ground. Because Shlomo Amel teaches me in Proverbs, don't be lazy about it, but go and learn. You're a lazy bones. Go and learn from the ant what it means to be, what's the opposite of lazy? To be very, whatever, right? And Asher ein lo katzin v'shoter umoshe. And look how much work the ant puts in without getting lazy, even though there's no one on top of the ant, no ruler that supervises and controls the ant. Tachin b'kaitz lachma, the ant will prepare the bread in the summertime and bring, little piece of bread into its, down there. What does he say here? Prepares her food in the summer for the winter. Oh, there's another thing. The ant doesn't steal from any of the other ants. And this is all without any ruler or overseer to compel her. Amar Ezel Echse. Okay, Shlomo Melech said it, and it's in Mishlei. But I, Reb Shimon ben Chalafta, I'm going to check this out. I want to see if this is true. Ivadahu de Leslie Malka. How the heck does Shlomo Melech know that there's no king ant that is calling the shots and ruling and supervising from the back? So Ozel b'tkufas Tammuz. Reb Shimon Chalafta went during the heat of the sun, of the summer. Parsei glimi, he takes a cloak to block out the shade, block out the sun, and Akina Dushumshaya on a hill of ants and gives it shade. Nafak Osachadinai, one of the ants comes out of the anthill and notices, hey, it's summertime, but there's shade. Isnach Bei Simona. So Reb Shimon Talafta puts a sign on that ant. I don't know how he did that exactly, but so that he could recognize that ant. All Amalahu, the ant goes back into the anthole and signals Nafa and Amalahu, he signals to the others, Nafal Tula. Guess what? There's shade over the anthill. Let's go out. Nafku Vyasu, they all proceeded to come out. And what does Reb Shimon ben Chalafta do? Dalia Leglime. He removes his cloak. Nafal Shimsha, the sun starts beating down. And now all the ants, Naflu Alei, they jumped on top of this one ant, which again, we know which one it is, and Katli, and they killed him. You're a no good liar. You're telling me the shade, there's no shade. It's burning hot in the sun. Omar and Reb Shimon Chalafta thought that this experiment would prove Shma Mina the Leslu Malka. The Islu, if they had a king, Harma de Malka Loli boy, are they allowed to just kill this ant without having a permission from the king. Now, this is very strange that Reb Shimon Bar Chalafta had to prove a pasuk. He had to do an experiment to prove a pasuk. Amalei Rav Acha Brei de Rav Ashi V'Dilma Malka Avi Badayev. Now, I don't even rely on this experiment. It doesn't prove a darn thing, because maybe there was a king, and the king signaled to them, kill that ant. Inami Harmona de Malka Avi Nikite. Maybe they had a general permission from the king that whenever you find an ant that mocks them or misleads them and lies to them, kill him. Inami, or another possibility is maybe there's a king, but the king died and they haven't yet appointed a replacement king. Dichsiv. And now we quote a pasuk in Shoftim. At the beginning of Shoftim, it says, "Vayom lahem lemelch yisrael isha Yoshev ben Yasa." El samach ahem nusei de Shlomo. The bottom line, says Rav Acha, is forget about these experiments. These experiments do not prove that the ants don't have a king. All we have to do is trust Shlomo HaMelech, who wrote Mishlei Beruach HaKodesh. And we're going to rely on the Ruach HaKodesh of Shlomo, that ants have no ruler, no king. So Tosfos immediately asked, how could Rav Shimon Chalafta question a pasuk that the ants have no king? Basically, he's scoffing at the words of the Torah. So Tosfos reinterprets this whole thing, that he wasn't trying to prove that Shlomo Melech was right in order to be machriya, to make that decision that Shlomo Melech is right. No, he knew Shlomo. He wanted to demonstrate how great is the Torah. Okay. Now the Gemara has a problem with Rav Huna. Rav Huna says that whether or not an animal that had an injury is a treifa, that depends on whether it could survive for 12 months. We have a brisa that has many, many opinions, and that opinion of Rav Huna does not appear in the brisa. Siman l'treifa, how do we know whether the animal is treif, says the brisa? So the first opinion is, kol sheni oledes. If it's a female animal, a female treifa cannot bear children, and if we have a suffix treifa, and we see that nevertheless this female animal bears a young, then we know therefore ipso facto it's not a treifa. Or Rav Shimon Gamliel Omer mishabeches v'oleches b'yadu shehish kshera. If the animal improves, that indicates that it was not a fatal injury. If, on the other hand, the opposite, misnavelos v'oleches, it deteriorates, we know, b'yadua she treifa. And now we have a third opinion. Rebbe says, siman l'treifa shloshim yom. We have a fourth opinion, that amru lo harbe miskaimos shtayim shloshim, that we should wait 3 years. So it's either the animal gave birth, or it's the animal improves its physical condition, or it's the animal lives for 30 days, or the animal lives for 3 years. But anyway, what's missing in this brisa is the opinion of Huna that it will survive for 12 months. And the Gemara answers Tanoi. Then in truth, there's a machlokas Tanoim about whether a treifa would survive 12 months. Meaning that if it doesn't survive, if it's a treifa, won't survive 12 months. It's Sanya, we went to the brisa, ubigilgoles. I'm not sure if we're talking about an animal or a bird here. Just give me a second. We're not talking about an animal, and we're not talking about a bird. I think we're talking about a human being. Yeah. So now we're going into Olos, and there's Bachlokas Beisil Beit Shammai in Olos, if you recall, about Tumas oil in the case where we find a corpse, but the skull is missing a piece. And the question is, what size is that piece that it's missing? And according to Beis Shammai, it's Nekev Echad Oroch. Just 1 second. I'm sorry. Just want to say he doesn't tell you here. I forget whether it's anyway. I'm not exactly sure what the size is, but it's called Nekev Echad Aroch, one long hole, or alternatively, Afilu Nekavim Harbe. Now we got this shit finally. How I forgot this when I learned this an hour ago, I don't know. Mitzarfin limlo magdeh. Right? How large is the hole bored by a drill? And if a piece of the skull is missing, then it's not called a corpse and it's not mitami v'tumas oil. Let me just see 1 second here. We had this already. No. Oh, oh, yeah. Just 1 second. Oh, so now we're talking here about the spinal column. There's a deficiency in the spinal column. According to Beis Hillel, if it's missing one single vertebra, then the animal is treifa. According to Beit Shammai, it's only two vertebrae that are missing. And the Gemara there on Daf Mem Beis makes an analogy between tumas oil and treifa. Rabbi Yossi ben Hamashulam, Maisa be'envol, I guess that's the name of a city. Be'echad shenifchasa Gulgolta, they found a corpse, and the skull was deficient, and it was missing a piece the size of a drill hole. The asulo chiduk shel keruya v'chaya. Wow! They took a piece of dried gourd and they stuffed it into that missing that hole that was as large as a drill hole, and he lived. So he's not a treifa. So you see that at least according to this opinion of Rabbi Yossi ben Hamashulam, if the person can live, then he's not a treifa. Treifa means incurable fatal injury. Amalo Reb Shimon ben Elazar, Misham Raya, just because in the place called Inval, they were able to save this guy's life by replacing the piece of skull that he was missing with a dried gore shell. Yemos Hachamahoya. It was during the summertime. who knows whether he lasted for 12 months? Kevacha Avrolov Yimosatsina, right? 6 months later, in the cold season, Miad Macy, in fact, died. So don't prove from that story that they really were able to permanently save him. Okay, let's just finish the Amud. Omar of Acha Bar Yaakov, Halacha, Trefi Oledes Mishpachas. The fact that an animal is a female animal is capable of bearing young, or the fact that after an injury you can improve the physical condition, that doesn't mean that it's not a treifa. Because even a treifa can bear young and can survive. Okay. So we're here on the bottom of Daf Nun Zayin and Beis. Thank you so much. And